Welcome to Let's Play. Today we're so excited to be joined by JoJo Zhou, who is head of narrative at Massive Monster, who is responsible for a lot of the narrative on Cult of the Lamb, and I'm so excited to talk with you today.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I know that you have a pretty extensive background in just writing in general. What is your writing background and how did you get to where you currently are?
Like many people who end up writers, I loved writing for a very long time. I studied a Bachelor of Communications looking at theatre, so my background is primarily in theatre and live performance. So I studied that, went on to do a Masters of Fine Arts, and then I just freelanced for ages. I did writing contracts for pretty much anything that would pay me. So a lot of live performance, like I said, but then also kind of like audio dramas and short films and multimedia installments, like installation art and things like that. And then I joined Massive Monster on Cult of the Lamb about 8 months prior to the release of the game. Julian, who's one of the creative directors there, I knew him before. He had seen some of my work and he just kind of shot me a message being like, would you mind coming on board helping out with some of the writing just as a contractor? And I was like, yeah, that sounds really fun. I've never written for a video game before, so I'd love to try it out. And worked on that, did heaps of the writing for it, along with some of the other directors. Game came out. It was successful enough that I was able to stay on board as a writer.
How do you craft a narrative built around gameplay?
It was really interesting coming from a different kind of writing industry, because the industry I came from, the writing and the script was the originator of everything that came after. So, that'd be a script for a play or a screenplay for a film. It was always started with the writing. Moving over to games, it's not that way. It has to start with the gameplay and the game experience. And so I found myself being really flexible and adaptive and crafting a narrative that suited the aesthetics and hit theme and tone in that way, but also contextualized gameplay and gave reason for players to be doing what they're doing. And so it's very much kind of taking the game experience that exists. In Cult of the Lamb's case, it is the dungeon crawler with the base builder and weaving a story around that. The kind of occult and godly elements already existed in the world. That was something the directors came up with and is such a, recognizable part of the game now. So writing for games is very much about tying the story into gameplay action. That's playable action the player does. It's giving context and reason to why they're doing that. So with Cult of the Lamb, it was very much looking at characters in terms of the playable characters, but also the NPCs, the main antagonists and enemies, and really giving depth to their reason. If they are trying to stop you, why are they trying to stop you from doing that? What is the kind of, human element behind their actions? And also about joining kind of ideas that already existed in the world. So looking very much, for me, it was about the cause and the effect. Cult of the Lamb The directors for Cult of the Lamb have really, really great storytelling instincts, and they created this really tight visual world and this really, really tight gameplay loop. A lot of the work I did was connecting the ideas that already existed in there. And so I was looking at things like, how is this character related to this character? How is this place related to this character? And kind of drawing all those things in really closely in the way that we understand storytelling and writing to be. Also, something that is very different about writing for a game is that you do have to account for a lot of variable experiences for players. So, you can kind of look at a plot point and say, okay, the player would have gone through this to be here, but they also could have done this, or they might have missed this, or anything like that. And you have to account for what their understanding is in that moment and the ways that might have changed based on the choices they've made. So writing for games, as opposed to other kind of forms of writing, is you have to be really highly flexible, really highly adaptable, and every narrative problem that you pose kind of has to be solved through gameplay. The two have to be really tightly linked. It's been really fun. A lot of it to me is kind of creative problem solving. So, we'll come up with this really cool idea for a boss fight or a mechanic or a system, and then my job is to very much be okay, well, how does that change the story of the world, or, inform the story of the world, and trying to move the pieces around to make a cohesive narrative. It's really, really fun in that way. It's kind of, I find it as a form of writing to be kind of highly engaging because of how much it changes, and it can be quite fast paced.
Yeah, is there a lot of back and forth between different teams where it's oh, we really want to do this, and then one team will be actually, that won't work?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much of that. It's all just so many moving parts that have to come together to make an experience. And there are so many times that I've been like, oh, I've got a really cool idea for a quest, and I'll like put a proposal together and pitch it. And then a department will come back and be like, that's actually impossible. We cannot make that in the game. And I'll be like, okay. And so then it's the process of like de-scoping that and be like, okay, what are the actions that we do have available for us? What's like the art and the animation that we have at our disposal? And how can that kind of be brought together in the right order to make a cool story?
I think you all have done a great job, like just looking at like the lamb, who is a player character who is very like influenced by, what the player chooses to do. They're still very much a like recognizable character doing stuff that you're like, oh yeah, the lamb.
Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, that's kind of like the genre that we play in, which is that you have the lamb and they have a name and they have like a distinct character identity in a way, but they are a blank slate for the player to project themselves onto. Unlike other games where you kind of like play as this character who has their own backstory and motivation and everything like that, the lamb is the puppet for the player. And so another fun part of like piecing this story together is thinking of the ways in which people will have controlled the lamb. Like, are they like trying to be a really kind and good and generous cult leader, or do they err more on the side of like, harsh punishments and violence and things like that, and making a world in which it is possible for them to do both of those things.
Especially working in the kind of roguelite, whatever term you prefer, area. Are there any like unique struggles with kind of that narrative scope of kind of repeating?
Yeah, there's definitely that element when you're writing for like a roguelite where you just have to let go of so much control, because so much of it is like, procedurally generated, like the dungeons and the weapons, and players can choose to go into dungeons or stay at the base more. You have to really let go of a lot of control. Which is a really fun and interesting challenge, because you're building a story not knowing the order in which it's kind of going to be received. There are definitely some things that we can guarantee. So, the third time they go into this dungeon, they will have this encounter. And that's how we kind of build the main story, like the stuff that you have to get through to understand the narrative of Cult of the Lamb. But then there are so many other bits which are you just don't know when they're going to encounter them or if they're going to want to. So things like, Easter eggs, or do they read the item descriptions? A lot of people don't. But using all of those like little bits to still contribute to world and theme and tone, even like achievements. I really like to use achievements to bring together themes and kind of like put like a nice little bow on an idea.
It's cool the number of like different levers you have to pull to tie things together.
It's really, really fun. So like, sometimes we'll think of like a really cool story idea, like, oh, this character should do this, or we should reveal this secret here. And then it's about kind of, in a way, like reverse engineering that with all the tools at our disposal and being like, okay, well, we've got like empty space here in terms of like item descriptions, or we can like put another little NPC encounter here, or like a secret quest line here. And that will contribute to this story in a way that really invites discovery. And I think that's the really, really fun thing about writing for a roguelite, is that just by virtue of its genre, it really invites exploration and discovery as a mode of uncovering narrative, which is just so fun, because you get to like really create a big world and invite players to step into it in whichever way they choose.
And I know you mentioned that when you were brought on, a lot of, the like backstory and mythos of the game had already been developed by the directors, but I imagine you probably also had to kind of immerse yourself in inspiration for that world. Like, what is your process for kind of looking at like real life cultural mythology sort of things as inspiration and turning them into something new?
That's a really good question. It's very much design led. Like, we will be led very much by the aesthetics and the art of it all. But again, like I said, the artists are really, really good storytellers themselves. Like, they will have a sense of what visually fits into a world. And so very often that will align with something that narratively fits into the world. So we very much look at where we start from, which is kind of this Judeo-Christian idea of the sacrificial lamb. I mean, the sacrificial lamb is found in a lot of mythologies, but very much like, the one who died and then was reborn. Jesus is the Lamb of Christ kind of thing. That is such a core tenet of, the originator of a lot of the story that came afterwards. And so it is like a lot of reading into a lot of mythology and parables and tales and things that can inform those choices. So, for example, if we start usually with like one really strong idea, and in this, sorry, we're still working on things, so I'm trying to think of things that like I'm trying to separate in my mind what's out and what's not. Um, I think looking at the bishops, who are like the kind of four, secretly five main antagonists of the game. The mapping that was done onto them, which was done before I arrived, was them as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And so, it's very much looking into what are those characters as we understand them outside of the game and what they represent. And then how can we strengthen that association and representation by tying in other similar aspects. We're looking always at, I never want to get too deep into mythology where then it becomes like kind of hard to understand. Like, I don't want people to have to read Wikipedia pages to be able to engage in like the mythos of this game. And so it's finding recognizable and more commonly known aspects like the Four Horsemen or like, the sacrificial lamb, and then building things around them, looking at parables of, Noah's Ark or the Garden of Eden, things like that, looking further into like paganism, midwinter rituals and things like that, Greek mythology as well. And finding things that we feel would be recognizable to the layman and then pushing them into a more fictional world of Cult of the Lamb, putting that special little occult twist on them, tying in the humor, attaching it to characters that we already know and things like that. So it is a very like research-based and then just heavily iterative process of being like, will people understand this? If no, scrap it. If yes, how can we kind of warp it to the edge of that understanding and make it very Cult of the Lamb?
Yeah, and I like that approach of, kind of as a player and a fan, you can be as involved in the in-depth lore as you want out of it.
Yeah, when we craft for Cult of the Lamb, I always think of the story in two layers. So in writing, you have narrative and story are actually separate things, and they mean separate things. So narrative is the order of events that is presented to the player or the audience, and story is literally everything else in that world. And so we have the narrative, which is these are the things, the plot points that you will go through from start to end, and you have to go through them to progress the story and understand what is happening. And then you have the story, which is, here is this like huge rich world that we've thought of, and it invites exploration and discovery. And, if you look into that, it will shed better understanding on the main events. But you need to account for all player experiences in that there will be players who just like blast through the main story, just being like, okay, here's the good guy, here's the bad guy, here's what I'm going to do, here's what happens afterwards. And you want them to have like a really smooth experience, players who don't like reading, too much in a game or whatever. And then you want to account for the player experience who, the people who are like, what does that mean? And what does this mean? And why is that happening? And, oh, they reference that there. Is that attached to something here? And they really want to like ferret things out and discover them and have like a kind of comprehensive understanding of the world. So I always think about it in those kind of two levels.
Yeah, and how do you kind of approach like adding those tidbits in that engage a player in the world, but also kind of like leave them wanting more?
It is very much about the leave them wanting more. Like, you kind of, in building a lore and world like Cult of the Lamb, you just want to give them just enough to kind of get what's going on and then no more than that. Because when you do that, instead of going to them, you're inviting them to come to you, and you're igniting their curiosity, and most importantly, you're leaving space for their imagination and room for them to form like headcanons and theories and create fan art and really, really deeply engage with the world. So when we're crafting those little tidbits, for me, it'll be like, okay, what is the main action? Like, what is the main narrative? And then what are things that I can do to like either complement or contrast that? So if you were to like go through the base game, you'll understand that there are bad guys who you're trying to beat because they're trying to like, keep your deity in prison, and you want to liberate him. So you have to beat these four guys. And that's all you need to know to get through the game. But then if you want to, you can do special side quests, and you can read like lore tablets, and you can get really deeply into the descriptions and the journals and things like that, and you will then have an understanding of how that happened and why that happened and how characters feel about it and stuff like that. So there is that one school where it's like, okay, these are the things that will enrich the narrative and change players' understanding of it. And then there are other little tidbits that are like, this is something new, because you want to seed offers in and really provide a lot of fodder for player imagination. And so sometimes we'll put things in and be like, oh, actually actually, this isn't hugely related to anything you know that's going on, but it does tell you something about the world, or it is, an invitation to think up something new. And then there is things that are like, okay, we know players have responded really, really well to this, so we would love to reward, or like not reward, but acknowledge their engagement with this game by providing like this fun little bonus thing that we know players really like or have really been asking for, or things like that.
Yeah, does kind of like fan response drive kind of what you then look to add in future updates?
Pretty much, yeah. If people respond really, really well to something, we do want to, yeah, give them more of that. It is that fine line of, we as the creators have like this vision for what we want this game to be and this story we want to tell. And then, there's things that the community really, really loves and is very important to them. And so it's walking that line of like, how can we satisfy both to their best ability? And most often those things do align, very fortunately. Yeah, but we have like a really, really great marketing community team who do such an amazing job of like recognizing what players want and passing that on to us. And we obviously love looking at like the fan art and all that kind of stuff.
Love some of your like responses on Twitter that are like, that's up to you fans to decide.
It is like, this is something that and I think about this a lot, actually. Sometimes people ask me really, really direct questions about, like, what does this mean? Or does that link to that? Or are we going to see more of this? And I feel really bad because my answers are always really vague, or I just straight up say, like, oh, I can't really talk about that. Because the way I look at it is we are building this world together. We are playing this game together. Like, if I gave you all of the answers for everything that we've got planned out, or everything I think about this, then we're not having fun anymore, because you're meant to discover it in the game. Like, this is something we're building together. It is nourished by your contributions and your imaginations. So yeah, I hope people understand that when I don't like answer those questions, it's because I want them to have the best experience possible with this story.
And is it like very different approaching telling stories in a space where like it is an expanding universe versus kind of like if you wrote a book or something, the book gets published and it's done and you're not really, like continuing to fine tune things?
Yeah, it is a weird experience, honestly. It's not one I've been in before, but one that has been really exciting. There's a part of it that's, the games industry can be kind of unstable. You never are really guaranteed of what you're going to be doing in 5 or 10 or whatever years. So you don't want to, like, speaking of story, you don't really want to forward plan that much, because it'll be quite frustrating if you set up this awesome story but you can't keep making the game in 5 years, and so nobody really knows how it ends. So it is that fine balance of the right amount of setup and the right amount of payoff. And then there's also that element of, every time we release an update, we do want to see what players really, really respond to, and what players really, really respond to will inform kind of what we do next, because this is something that we're building together. So yeah, writing for this expanding universe is really fun and really, really challenging. And while we do have ideas of what's like coming up and what we're doing next, there's also so much room within that for us to like reimagine or change course or adapt.
Yeah, and I know you were also working on the comic update earlier this year, the Pilgrim comic. What was it like jumping into a comic space versus game space?
It was awesome. I really loved making Pilgrim. Me and Carlos, the artist, and shout out, everyone should buy it. It was really fun. I hadn't written professionally for a comic. Like, I'd never gotten, actually asked to do it. I wrote heaps of comics and made heaps of them when I was younger. So it was like a really magical, awesome thing for me to make a comic and have it, be printed and, have my name on it and stuff. That was very exciting. This is Pilgrim. It's beautiful. It's like gorgeously illustrated as well. But yeah, it was not dissimilar from a game in that in Cult of the Lamb, we also use a text box style of delivery, like a speech bubble that you would have in comics. And so in that way, I didn't feel hugely challenged by, really cutting down on the writing and showing more through the visuals, because that's something you do in a visual medium anyway. But the best part about writing for this comic in this expanding universe was honestly that we got to leave the Lamb. Like, the Lamb has a story. It's in Cult of the Lamb. People know it. People play it. People really love it. But it always has to come back to them because they're the playable character. So writing for a comic, we got to use different protagonists who get to interact with and see this gorgeous world in a completely different way. And it was just another perspective and lens on it. And also, just from a visual element, you're not stuck with the illustrative limits of a video game. Cult of the Lamb is like, 2.5D. You can't really leave that perspective, which, means that you don't really get to play with scale and stuff that much. But in a comic, you can look at it from any angle and you get a sense of how big or how small things are in it. You get like a different sense of how dynamic movement can be and where characters live and where they go. So you get to meet them in different ways and experience so many different things. And it was so much fun to make.
Well, it was super fun to read too, so thank you.
Oh, thanks for reading it.
And I guess going off that, do you have a favorite NPC?
My favorite NPC, I have so many. The characters from the comic end up in the game, which is really cool. The two stories come together, and I love them dearly. But I think my favorite NPC would have to be Chamak, who is one of the merchant NPCs. She will give you relics as you go through the dungeon runs. She was we have a few more of them now, but she was the first really nuts character that I got to properly write from, build from scratch. And I love a crazy lady. I also love writing riddles and rhymes, and she speaks a lot in those. I find that really fun to create. And also we haven't been able to do it yet, but I have a whole story planned for her, a whole backstory for her that I would love to one day see the light of day. Don't know if it will, but it's one I'm really excited about.
I feel like I'm a big fan of Fornius just because big cat fan. But then it's
Fornius.
She's got such sad backstory.
She was one that we loved making. That was something that arose really organically in the development process, where we had Fornius was a character and Eamon Baal were characters, and we looked at them and we were like, they're all black cats. There could be some kind of relation there. And so, yeah, it just kind of turned into this quite sad story that does get a resolution later on if you keep playing in the post-game updates. But yeah, so she does always have a place in my heart, especially because of how well people have responded to her, and her, and Eamon Baal as well.
Yeah, and that's something also I love, that all of these merchant NPCs and other ones, they have such connections to each other that you can kind of piece together with bits as you go throughout the game.
Yeah, it's really fun. I feel just a crazy person with strings and things connecting each other, and I'm okay, that person's connected to this character, and then that means that, and this is where they came from. It's really fun. It's a good way to be crazy.
And yeah, so for the overall tone of the game, it's a very cute game, but it's also dealing with all of these horror elements. How do you approach kind of balancing that to create a final product?
I keep saying it's really fun for every answer. It is really fun. I really like my job. Because the art style already balances on that duality of really, really cute to eldritch horror. It is it's kind of easy to get the writing tone to do the same, because people do expect certain ways of characters that look a certain way to speak a certain way. And so sometimes if I write a stupid little line or a quest about poop, but there's these silly little characters saying it, it's not going to cause a lot of dissonance. And same with the eldritch horror characters. They can speak really flowery, really poetically, using archaic language and things like that, and the dissonance isn't really there because they look like they should speak like that. But it's, I guess, the beauty of it is just putting the two things next to each other creates such an absurd and surreal humor that means you kind of can get away with a lot, because it's funny. It's weird that these things exist next to each other. And it's weird that is the span of my job, to write these cute little fun things and also these really grandiose statements that are about faith and belief and everything like that. So I find that working on a project like this, and one that allows me to be so flexible and get such range in the things I write, to be really, really rewarding. And when you are able to subvert those things, you have cute little characters who say really horrible eldritch things, or when you have really, spooky looking characters say silly little things, that's just the humor comes out of that subversion as well.
Yeah, and are there any sort of narrative pitfalls you often see games falling into that you try to avoid? I know you mentioned previously it's hard to get some players to read things, etc.
Yeah, I think I talk a lot to writers in other mediums who really are interested in games, because that's the path I took, and so I really love speaking to other writers who want to make that move too. And the biggest thing I do say is that one, if you write for games in like a game that I write for, you have to let go of like so much authorial control, because you have to, one, make room for every single other department to do their work, like, you know, art and programming and all that kind of stuff. And two, people generally, this is a huge generalization, players don't come to games for a textual experience. Games are a tactile and mechanical experience, a sonic experience, a visual experience. And so it's very much about, I guess the nicest way being, maybe backseating your writing. Like, often feel about the work I do that my writing is there to really support and uplift all the other elements of the game. And yes, the writing is really important because it is your most direct means of communicating with a player, to be like, this is what you're doing, this is what you need to do. But in terms of like a storytelling experience, a lot of that is about, you know, adding to or changing players' understandings of the other experiences they're having in the game. And so I often find when I play games that you have to like encounter really big chunks of text, or, you know, conversation interactions go for like a really quite a long time. And this is without cutscenes, because I've never really barely worked in cutscenes. It can be like, it can really disengage you from the experience you're having, because you are having a passive one. Sitting there and reading is a passive experience, and games work best when they are active experiences. And then on like a pet peeve level, like widow and orphan words, like if you, which is like from a graphic design thing, it's a word that's just kind of like hanging on, or, you know, just like the indents happened and it's just sitting there. Like if you are like punching through the text and you've like read this full page of text and then you go to the next page and it's just like 2 words, I'm like, you could have rewritten that so it was all on 1 page. Or because if you're writing dialogue, if a player has to press A through it, you want your lines of dialogue to mimic the rhythm of conversation, because it will feel like they're playing an organic part in this interaction with another character. And so when there are just like 1 or 2 words hanging on at the end, I'm always like, that's not how people talk. People don't say a whole sentence and then pause for a beat and then go, me too, you know?
Yeah, working in publishing widow and orphan words was something I learned from designers early on, where they were like, please stop doing this. I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Honestly, it's something I never really thought too hard about until I went into games, because I was like, oh, it does make a difference. It ruins the rhythm.
It's like something you're unaware of until you know about it, and then you're like, oh no, I was so blissfully unaware before this.
Oh my gosh, that was my whole journey into games. Like, there was like quite a steep learning curve. The main one being, as I just said, people don't really want to read that much. And so the main feedback I got from the directors when I started was just like, can you make this shorter? And I'm like, but. And then it's like, no, it has to be shorter. It just has to be.
All right, so finally, I have kind of our fun question for people we interview, which is, if you could turn any written work into a video game, what would you pick?
I would pick, and this is kind of like a ho answer, if that makes sense. The Little Prince, which is a very famous book. I think my imagination for it, here's my hot pitch. I feel like it could contain the playfulness and majesty of like Super Mario Galaxy 2 or Mario Odyssey, because they like deal so much with planets, and like the image of running around a little planet I always found so cool. It could combine that with the kind of poignancy of like a game like Journey, or even like What Remains of Edith Finch. Like, I can imagine, because the book is so much, right, about holding on to like love and childlike wonder, and, you know, it's about how you become an adult and then you don't see this magic in this world. And I feel like a game which you play, because play is such like a joyful thing and one that we associate with childlike wonder, would be a really good genre for The Little Prince. I also think it could look amazing.
And I feel like I'm already imagining the soundtrack, and it would be like,
oh my god, it would be
very
so
beautiful.
Be one of those games that you just like put down afterwards and weep, you know? God, I would love to play that. Somebody make that, please.
It could be you.
It could be me. Somebody give me money to make The Little Prince a video game.
Yeah, that's always the thing. And I guess one other thing I'll tack on, and totally fine if you don't have any top of mind answers, but are there any, like, you know, other written works you turn to for inspiration?
I get inspiration from heaps of stuff. Very much like kind of religious texts. Like, I do read a lot of the Bible. I know that's weird. but the Bible contains like has a really strong use of metaphor to teach lessons and things like that, like heaps of really really strong imagery, and also has a very distinct kind of way of using language in terms of how they write. But I also love a lot of things that have like really strong world building. I find really really engaging. I've read a bit of the Game of Thrones series. What else is there? I'm like literally looking around at the books in my room. Yeah, I don't know. I like a lot of young adult fantasy. I'm really really drawn to as well. Um, and then I don't know. The others is just like technical writing manuals that I really really enjoy reading.
I do really love the idea of like just you there studying the Bible and then going into work to work on Cult of the Lamb.
Pretty
The
much.
contrast of
And like things it's so weird, and like also like a lot of like Greek mythology and writings about like paganism and stuff like that, things that like I said like have like kind of strong ways of looking at the world in a really kind of visual and metaphorical sense, because we like to like pinch those images and metaphors and just pop them in the game with a little twist.
All right, well, thank you so much for chatting with me. This has been so fun.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's been really fun to talk to you. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, everyone check out Call of the Lamb if you haven't, though I feel like it's such a popular game that everyone has played it at this point. But if you haven't, check it out.
Yes, please play Cult of the Lamb, and send us your fan theories because I really like to read them.